Last week, we took a look at the Apostle John and how he moved the mission forward after Jesus died. It was very humbling to look at a guy that stayed true to discipleship even into his 90s. And that's the mission that we're moving forward. Discipleship. The mission that Jesus left his disciples. It's recorded in Matthew chapter 28, and it's what we call now the Great Commission. But the Great Commission wasn't just for the apostles. It's for all people who follow Jesus. And the man we'll be looking at today wasn't an apostle. He was actually a Pharisee, a man named Nicodemus. Now, there isn't much said about Nicodemus in the Bible. In fact, he's only mentioned on 3 separate occasions, and all 3 mentions are in the Gospel of John. What we can see from these 3 stories is growth. The first time he's mentioned is in John chapter 3. We'll start in verse 1, where it says this. Now there was a man, a Pharisee, named Nicodemus, who was a member of the Jewish ruling council. He came to Jesus at night and said, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher who has come from God, for no one could perform the signs you are doing if God were not with him. So the first thing we see about Nicodemus is that he's a Pharisee. Now, Pharisees, they were teachers of the law. They were very knowledge-based men who devoted their lives to studying and teaching God's word. Nowadays, we have a pretty negative view of Pharisees because, well, Jesus treated them pretty harshly. But back in the day, they were essentially what we would consider the pastors or the ministers. They were thought very highly of. And not only was Nicodemus a Pharisee, he was on the Jewish ruling council. So he was at like the top of the religious food chain, and he would have had lots of credibility and power. But the important thing to notice about this interaction is that John specifically mentions that Nicodemus went to Jesus at night. Those 2 words are incredibly important. They show that he was not wanting others to see his meeting with Jesus. You see, just before the meeting in John chapter 2, Jesus had just gone and he cleared out the temple. So you could understand why a man like Nicodemus wouldn't want to be associated with a person like Jesus. So whether he was embarrassed or maybe even scared, Nicodemus meets with Jesus at night because he doesn't want others to know. This interaction between Nicodemus and Jesus, it's incredibly powerful. And as we read through this passage, we see that Nicodemus is asking a lot of questions. He just wants to know the teachings of Jesus and to understand them fully. And I mean, it makes a lot of sense since he's a Pharisee. And the main takeaway from John chapter 3 is that he will never fully understand all of Jesus' teachings. And that's okay. He just needs to focus on Jesus. He needs to keep his eyes on Jesus. Jesus even uses an illustration from Numbers 21, an illustration Nicodemus would have been very familiar with his study of the Torah, to teach him about keeping his focus on Jesus. Unfortunately, we don't really see Nicodemus' response to this meeting. Jesus gives him a verdict, a takeaway, or maybe even an obey statement for Nicodemus to do in verses 19 through 21. But verse 22 isn't his response. John just moves on to the next thing Jesus did. So for us to see how it affected him, we have to jump ahead to John chapter 7. By this point, Jesus is gaining ground as not just an amazing teacher, but many are saying he's even a prophet, and some the Christ, the Messiah. Well, this doesn't set well with the Pharisees because they're expecting a much different looking Messiah than what Jesus is teaching. So they want him arrested for blasphemy. And in this interaction amongst the Jewish leaders, we get to see Nicodemus. Starting in verse 45 of John 7, it says, Finally, the temple guards went back to the chief priests and the Pharisees, who asked them, Why didn't you bring him in? No one ever spoke the way this man does, the guards replied. You mean he has deceived you also? The Pharisees retorted. Have any of the rulers or the Pharisees believed in him? No. But this mob that knows nothing of the law, there is a curse on them. Nicodemus, who had gone to Jesus earlier and who was one of their own number, asked, Does our law condemn a man without first hearing him to find out what he's been doing? They replied, Are you from Galilee too? Look into it, and you will find that a prophet does not come out of Galilee. So the Pharisees are super upset and are very prideful here. They know they can't be wrong, and since they believe that Jesus isn't the Messiah, then he must be a deceiver. And they place a curse on all who are believing his message. And here is where Nicodemus speaks up in defense of Jesus. Now, it's not really an incredible leap of faith by him here, but it is definitely a statement. Really, he's just saying that they need to be just judges and let Jesus give his defense to the court before they arrest and condemn him. He isn't given an answer by the other leaders. They just challenge him and they attack his character. But it can't be passed over exactly what Nicodemus did here. He put his neck on the line and he challenged the rest of the council. Now again, we don't know exactly what happens next. All we know is that this moment, it's the last time he's mentioned as a Pharisee. The next time John mentions him in his gospel is after Jesus is crucified and is being taken to the tomb. And what we see in this passage is that Nicodemus isn't identified as a Pharisee anymore. Now, I don't want to read too much into this because he very well may have been one. But let's actually jump into John chapter 19, starting in verse 38, to see our last passage about Nicodemus. Later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. Now, Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, because he feared the Jewish leaders. With Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. Taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with the spices in strips of linen. This was in accordance with Jewish burial customs. So the only qualification John lists about Nicodemus here is that he was the guy who visited Jesus at night. But we also see that he's being affiliated with a secret disciple of Jesus. So something has changed in him. He was also present at the crucifixion, or at least directly after it, to help get the body in the tomb. But the most important detail here is how many pounds of spices that Nicodemus brought with him. You may have read over it quickly, but John records that he brought 75 pounds of spices. 75. That's not something you can just hide in your robe. He had on full display how much he was supporting Jesus. Not just with his resources, his money, because that would have been a lot of money, but with the physical amount that he had with him. He was making a statement as to how he valued Jesus. So this is where we have to start assuming some things about Nicodemus. Now, these assumptions, they are based on his actions, but the Bible doesn't tell us exactly what happens next, or his standing with the Pharisees or lack thereof, or if and how he exactly moved the mission forward by being a disciple of Jesus. But there are many traditions passed down through history of Nicodemus becoming a follower of Jesus and leading others to him. But whether those stories are true or not, we do see a man who searched out Jesus to find answers. He put his neck and his reputation on the line for Jesus, and who put his money where his mouth was and made a very public support of Jesus after he died. Nicodemus is a guy who shows that there are different ways to move the mission forward.